There we are. I have a long message to read to you. Good afternoon. I'm Denny Doyle, Mayor of the City of Beaverton, President of the League of Oregon Cities. So I want to say welcome to you all for lunch, and I'm looking forward to the program in a bit. But first, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. Okay, I do it right, finally, the last time. At this time, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this afternoon's lunch and the event that we're going to have a lot of fun with. National Purchasing Partners, the Prothman Company, HDR Engineering, the Oregon State University Extension Service, sorry ducks, the law firm of Patterson, Buchanan, and Phobes, and Leach, Northwest Playground Equipment, and Staples. So to all of our sponsors, once again, on behalf of the League, I'd like to thank you for your generous financial support in helping us keep our ability to actually have a great closing. And now, it is a great honor, the President of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mayor Doyle. A pleasure. Well, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to see so many members of the journalistic community here with us today. And I know that some of you have complained that I never talk about myself. But you see, I've never wanted my personal history or my purely personal views to be an issue. But I reckon I don't want my reticence to itself become an issue. And so today, with the long national nightmare through which we have been struggling for 4 years to nearly at an end, I'm going to break with precedent just a little bit and yammer about myself, reluctantly. Well, you know, I say that now, I hardly know where to begin. Begin at the beginning, I reckon. I was born February 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. And I grew up on small farms there and in southern Indiana. And then later as a young man in Illinois that, well, they were all hard work and little reward. My folks, my mom and my pa, were strong anti-slavery people. And I suppose you could say that I took that attitude in with the very air that I breathed. Now, I didn't care much for farm work. Well, I'll tell you the truth, I hated it. But I realized if I was going to do anything else with my life, I'd have to make something of myself. Now, I wish I could tell you that I did that through long years of hard study in school, but the truth of it is I don't reckon I spent more than 1 year altogether in one classroom or another. Still, somehow I learned to read and to write. And I thought, well, I'll take these very modest skills and become a lawyer. Now, I didn't go to law school neither. I did what we called reading the law, serving as kind of an apprentice in a law firm until I could join the bar and start my own practice. And long about these same years, I was in my 20s, I thought maybe I wanted to become a public figure. So I ran for the Illinois State Legislature. I served 3 terms there. And a single term back in Congress. Some of us members of the Whig Party, which I belonged back then, we'd promised each other we'd only serve a single term back there and we'd take turns. So I came home from Congress in 1848, and I figured, well, if anybody asked, I told them that political career was over. I was through with politics, or politics were through with me. But in any case, I figured it was all over. I went back in the courtroom, me and my partner, Billy Herndon, and we did well. But over the next few years, as this problem of slavery, which had plagued our union ever since its inception, started to turn into something like a crisis, when the Supreme Court of the United States of America declared that no black man had any right that any white man had to respect in a court of law, and they intimated perhaps no state could constitutionally outlaw slavery. Well, I begin to think maybe there's something more important than patent law and railway rights of way. So after nearly 10 years out of office, I jumped back into politics. I filed for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas. You see, Douglas had helped to dismantle his Missouri Compromise, a series of measures, really, that were framed to stop the growth of slavery and so save this union. So by tearing that apart, you might say I had a bone to pick with him. And he and I, we traveled the state laying our case out before the people of Illinois in a series of debates that, well, they went something like this. Well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, now it's taken a lot to get this old war horse out of the stall. I seek an office that I never thought that I'd be seeking. Senator in the national government in Washington. And we've got to talk about something that I had hoped in this year of 1858 would never again be a national issue. Now, slavery is an evil. But we are not responsible for it here in the state of Illinois. We long ago banned slavery. And neither the Congress nor the President has any authority under the Constitution to interfere with slavery in those states where it exists. But now the extension of slavery into those territories not yet even organized as states that Senator Douglas is promoting, well, that's a different matter. Like most of you here, I reckon if we can just stop the growth of slavery, well, it's going to wither away and die on its own. Now, I know my opponent in this series of debates and in this election, he tells me all this about slavery extension. Well, that's just a minor matter. A minor matter. I ask you, sir, how many legs would a sheep have if you were to call a tail a leg? Can you tell me? Only four. That's absolutely right. Because calling a tail a leg don't make it so. And calling this a minor matter don't make it so. You must be a sheep man. Most people say 5. Well, I read a lot from slave owners. And they're saying that, well, slavery is beneficial to the slave. Well, maybe I've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe we want to start slavery over again right here in Illinois, and I know how we're going to do it. We're going to start with volunteers. Who here would like to be a slave? All right. We'll start it another way then. We'll start with those who would enslave others. If they want to tell us how beneficial slavery is to the slave, well, let's try it out on them and see how they like it. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a slave owner. I know my opponent says that I'm being two-faced on this issue, but ladies and gentlemen, I ask you now, do you reckon that if I had 2 faces, I'd be wearing this one? Listen to our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, how can a slave consent to the government over him? What we need to do is to readopt the Declaration of Independence and those policies and practices that harmonize with it. And you know what will happen if we do? If all Americans, North and South, join in this great and good work, well, we will not only have saved this union, but we shall have so saved it as to make it and keep it forever worthy of the saving. Well, as I suppose you know, I lost that election. I fell into a deep melancholy. I even asked my law partner, Billy, if he wouldn't take my folding knife away from me, lest I do something foolish with it. But you know, what I saw is the end of my public career. Others saw as a beginning. You see, folks started coming to me, telling me I'd gained national attention, even in my loss to Stephen Douglas. They told me I could have the 1860 presidential nomination of the new Republican Party because, they said, I was the one man who could stop the growth of slavery and so save this union. Well, I can't very well stand up here and tell you I'm not an ambitious man, can I? No one knows until that presidential grub starts gnawing at him just how deep it'll get until he's tried it. Well, I won the 1860 Republican presidential nomination, and with the United Party behind me, and our opponents split up into factions, just as our union was threatening to split up, I won the election in November. But within days of that election, state legislatures in the South started to vote illegally, unconstitutionally, for secession, forming the so-called Confederate States of America. For the first couple of weeks of this administration, we worked night and day trying to resolve this crisis without bloodshed. But when rebel troops in South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, the war began. You remember those days? Some folks acted like they'd been looking forward to it. It was all going to be over quick and easy, they said. Nothing but a picture book war, nobody really hurt. You know, the only thing that happened quickly and easily is the story of this rebellion quickly became a chronicle of political wrangling and military setback. I put a fellow named McClellan in charge of the army, and he wouldn't move for months, despite my urging. Yeah, when he finally got going, he got his army close enough to Richmond, Virginia, the rebel capital, that they could hear the church bells ringing on Sunday morning. And then the fighting started. Our soldiers, they did well. But McClellan, he retreated after every victory that he gained. That was back when every member of my cabinet thought he could do this job better than I was doing it, when half the members of Congress scoffed at me. But here was my dilemma. I could not gain the full support of the considerable number of abolitionists who controlled the balance of power in the Congress unless I were to free the slaves. But even if I had had the constitutional authority to end slavery, which I did not, if I had made any move for the first year and a half of this conflict, any move to end slavery, the 4 slaveholding states that stayed with the Union, well, they'd have crossed over to the other side and we'd have lost this war. That was back when I was telling anybody who'd listened to me that I hoped throughout this conflict to have God on my side, but I had to have Kentucky. We were certainly in no great danger of winning the war back then. Every month, thousands of our boys were dying behind men who called themselves generals. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, in a personal way, it did. My son Willie, 11 years old, he developed a fever in the White House. And children get fevers. And me and his mother, we stayed up every night with him, holding his hand. But he died. You'll excuse me. I received a letter from Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist, and himself a former slave, and he wrote to me, "You fight this war with only one hand, Mr. Lincoln. The Negro is the key to the situation. the pivot on which the whole rebellion turns. Teach the rebels and traitors that the price they are to pay for their attempt to abolish this government must be the abolition of slavery. I knew he was right, and I decided that the time had come. Now, as I said, I had no constitutional authority to end slavery, but I believed strongly, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, I did have the authority to deny rebels any resource that furthered their ability to oppose this people's government. So in September of 1862, a year and a half into this fight, I issued a proclamation of emancipation, not ending slavery, but freeing all slaves who were at that moment in areas controlled by the rebels. Now, I was painfully aware that this did not free anybody who was currently under our control, but only those who were not under our control. But that was all I could do, and I did it. Some folks say that I am a slow walker, and that may be, but I never have to walk back. I spoke to the Congress. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, senators, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will know how to save our country. My fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we now pass will light us in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We say we are for the Union. The world knows. We do know how to save it. We, even we here, have the power, and so we bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slaves, we guarantee freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Well, the press weighed in. I hope I won't be stepping on anybody's toes if I read a couple of selections, but I'll tell you what, if you'll forgive me for reading it, I'll forgive you for writing it. How's that? Baltimore Sun. This president and his administration are now adrift in a current of radical fanaticism. New York Herald. The cowardly tyrant who now disgraces the chair of Washington and Jefferson could, any day, have peace and restoration of the Union, and he would have them. Only he insists on continuing this war, merely to free the slaves. Merely to free the slaves. There is this from a soldier of the Union armies. It is no longer the Union as it was that is to be reestablished, but the Union as it should be, washed clean of its original sin. We are no longer merely the soldiers of a political controversy. We are now the missionaries of a great work of redemption. We have looked for greater meaning in this terrible war. And we found that while we thought we were doing one thing, we were in fact doing something else. That's when I realized what I had known all along, that what began as a conflict over union had become a revolution over men's souls. From that day on, this was altogether a new war. And yet it seemed like nothing had changed. Here in the East, particularly, where so much attention is focused, our armies knew nothing but defeat. I finally fired McClellan late in 1862, replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside, who proved to be a disaster. So just months after I appointed him, I had to relieve him of command early in 1863, replace him with General Joseph Hooker. And fighting Joe Hooker, he was just a disaster of another kind. And just months after I appointed him, I had to replace him with General George Meade. And now General Lee, he took his rebel army across the Potomac into the north, and he disappeared. Anybody who was here in Washington back then remembers the tension in this city so heavy you could hardly breathe. But our soldiers, they had a new spirit now. They didn't care who was general anymore. They knew that a defeat at this point would mean the end of the war, end of our Union, and defended now their homes and their families. They were determined that this should not happen. Well, the two armies finally stumbled into each other just across the Pennsylvania state line in a little town called Gettysburg. And there they fought for 3 days with this Union hanging by a thread every moment of that fight. Until finally, on the last day of that fight, for the first time in this war, our boys sent the main attack of General Lee's army running from the field. But the price, 8,000 men dead in 3 days. The cemetery was laid out in the hills above Gettysburg. The boys north and south were buried there, side by side. And in the fall of that year, November of 1863, a great dedication of that cemetery was planned. The finest orator of our day, Edward Everett, he was called on to express the solemn pride of the nation. As a sort of afterthought, the organizers asked him if I wanted to come up from Washington and, how'd they put it, deliver a few appropriate remarks. They were hoping I would say no, as I have not been popular. But I told him yes, for I had something to say. So after Edward Everett had spoken for a little over 2 hours, I stood up. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who have fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be so dedicated to the great task remaining before us. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. You know, I dream often that I am on a ship which is broken loose from its moorings. A ship of which I am the captain. But I cannot steer it. It seems that in any great contest, both sides claim to be acting in accordance with God's will. But God can't be both for and against the same thing at the same time, can he? God wills this struggle. And he wills that it not end yet. By his mere quiet power, he could have saved or destroyed this union without a human contest. But the contest began, and having begun continues to achieve some great purpose that we do not fully understand. Philadelphia Inquirer. It is the vacillation and indecision of the president that is the real reason why our armies have not succeeded in the destruction of the enemy. Even members of his cabinet, including Secretary of War Stanton, considered him nothing more than a backwoods fool. Did Stanton call me a fool? Well, I'd better go have a talk with him then. Because Stanton's usually right. You know, when I was a young man, I had only one distinction of which I was very proud. I was the ugliest man in our county. And then I heard that a new family had moved in, and the father of that family, well, he was apt to give me a run for my money. Well, what was I going to do? I grabbed a mule and a shotgun, that's what I did, and I went out to greet him. And I found him out there, plowing like in his field, and he looks up at me and he said, well, it's mighty neighborly of you to come out here and visit a new family, but I'm made a little uneasy by that shotgun, sir. What exactly is your purpose? And I told him, I said, I have always been the ugliest man in this county, and I can see right now you're going to take my place. So I've come out here to shoot you. And the feller said, well, I'm beginning to think you ain't so neighborly after all. But the truth is, if I'm uglier than you are, go ahead and shoot. Oh, I laugh. I laugh because I cannot weep. That's all. That's all. Well, as fall of 1863 turned into the winter, and then the spring of 1864, that great victory at Gettysburg seemed like nothing but a glimmer of light in a world of gloom. My friends, not to mention my enemies, told me that I could not be reelected in the fall, and I agreed with that assessment. I figured that when November came along, the people of this country were going to send me packing back to Springfield, where I could once again take up the practice of law. Well, just last summer, as you'll recall, late in the summer of 1864, the fortunes of our armies on the field of battle took a dramatic turn for the better. And for the first time, people thought, well, maybe they could see an end to that war coming. So when Election Day rolled around, they decided they wanted me to stay. And I figured, well, if that's what they want, I reckon I better do it. One newspaper put it, is there anybody here from Harper's Weekly? Well, Harper's Weekly put it, long Abraham Lincoln, a little longer. Well, just a couple weeks ago, as you know, I put together some remarks for the ceremony, my second inauguration. I think people were expecting me to hit a note of triumph, to say we were about to win this war because God was on our side, and we were right. That's the sort of speech people expected me to give. But I gave them this one instead. At my first appearance to take the oath of the presidential office 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. But one side would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other side would accept war rather than let it perish. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. And all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Both sides read the same Bible, and they pray to the same God, and each invokes his name against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. The prayers of neither has been answered fully. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And yet, if God wills it to continue, until all of the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God grants us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, we have seen dramatic events over the past week with the surrender of General Lee's army in Virginia on Sunday, and the surrender of General Johnston's army in North Carolina expected hourly. This war is essentially over. This nation is something new now, something it was not, could not have been before. Maybe we have washed away something of our original sin, and we can stand newborn and redeemed. And maybe because of that new birth, God will find a way to forgive us. Well, now, I said I didn't want to talk too long, and I've been yapping for I'm not sure how long. You'll have to forgive me. I know that your readers are hoping for news from the Capitol with the end of the war coming as we hope so quickly. And so with your readers in mind, I will take your questions. Who has a question for the President? Yes, sir.
Mr. Lincoln, I greatly admire your perseverance and dedication, and thank you for all you've done. And you've spoken tonight a lot about your aversion to slavery and perhaps God's will that we suffer this scourge because of it. And I appreciate your steadfast efforts toward that. I'm a little troubled by a quote that I read. I followed a lot of what you've done and written and said over the last several years.
That's all right. I read some of what I've said, and it makes me upset, too.
There's a quote that bothers me. It sounds almost like political two-speak. If I have it right, I think it says you were quoted in saying, if I could free all of the slaves, and in this war I would do that. And if I could free none of the slaves, and in this war I would do that too. And if I could free some here, and others not here, I would do that too. Help me understand how that measures with your feelings.
Were you able to hear that in the back? If not, I'll repeat it. I wrote it, so I suppose I can do that. I was right into Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune. And he had said something about the policy I seemed to be pursuing. I told him I didn't want anybody to be confused. And yes, I said, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save it by freeing some and leave others alone, I would do that too. And I assured him that this was me speaking in a question of policy and was separate from my personal opposition to slavery. But I suppose I can say this now. I could not say it at the time. I had written the Emancipation Proclamation at that point, which, as I explained, freed some, but not all the slaves, because I had no authority to free all the slaves. And I was trying to get folks ready for this. I knew there would be a great deal of opposition, even in what I had put out, this Proclamation of Emancipation. I was waiting for a victory by the Union armies in order to put that out, and I hadn't done that at that point. And so I was trying to prepare people that I might just do that I would free some and leave others alone. But if I may say, others understood, once the proclamation was put out, they understood this very well. Frederick Douglass said, "Thank God I have lived to see this righteous day. Mr. Lincoln will take no step backward." And I like to think that that's good enough for me, but that's a very good question, and thank you very much. Another question, yes, sir.
Mr. President, I wrote this down.
Uh-oh.
How do we, both now and in the future, bring a country so sharply divided politically, economically, culturally, how do we bring a country together?
Well, just politically, I think the most important thing to say is the country was never split into two. It was always one country. And we have simply stitched it back together. And I do not want vengeance taken on the South or its leaders. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, not Abraham Lincoln's, and not yours. I want an easy peace. That's the only way we'll put this country back together. And I also fear that if we take our retribution on the defeated Southerners, they will take theirs on the freed slaves. I wish to see that happen. Now, in regard to the freed slaves, we have started a Freedmen's Bureau. We're building schools, looking to rights. I have, as you know, there are no federal laws or anything in the Constitution that says the federal government has any control over who votes. That's entirely up to the states. So I cannot say that we will now allow the freed slaves or freedmen from before the war to vote. But I can ask, as I have already, the governors of Louisiana and Tennessee, which are under Union control again, I have asked them to please strongly consider allowing at least veterans and others to vote. And I hope they will. This is a very important step. But I want no retribution. We've got to put the country back together again. Yes, sir.
What qualities made you to choose Grant?
What qualities on Grant's part of my own caused me to choose General Grant, who eventually became commander of all Union armies, as you know. I had been mindful of General Grant's career since early in the war. He had proven that he could win victories of very quick and decisive action, as at Forts Donelson and Henry. He proved to some controversy when he was surprised at the Battle of Shiloh. He proved that he could keep his wits about him. He was calm throughout that, and though his army got badly beaten on the first day when General Sherman came up and said, "Well, what are we going to do?" He said, "Well, we'll whip them tomorrow." And they did. They drove the Confederates from the field. At Vicksburg, which is a campaign I think will be studied as long as military warfare is studied, he put together, I think, one of the most brilliant sieges. It showed great tenacity and great creativity in cutting his own supply lines and sending his army out without normal supply lines and yet winning that siege. And so I brought him back here, and I know there's been a lot of concern, none greater than mine, about the terrible casualties we have seen in the last year. And it's interesting, General Lee has called General Grant a butcher, even while General Lee has very, very favorable things to say about other Union commanders, McClellan, Pope, Hooker, Burnside, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what is the difference between them and General Grant? Oh yes, General Grant beat him. And these casualties weigh on me terribly. But while we had gotten almost nowhere in 3 full years of war, General Grant's come out here in 1 year, he's ended this war. And I would rather, just General Sherman's march to the sea has created a great deal of controversy, but I would rather concentrate on how many lives have we saved by ending this war quickly, even though very violently, than by continuing a stalemate for who knows how long. Another question. Well, yes, sir.
Mr. President, I want to thank you for your steadfast leadership in this conflict. I was born a Hoosier, and I have a sort of more of a less of a lighthearted question.
I could use one of those.
Back in the woods, we heard tell that you jumped out of a second-story window as a state legislator to avoid voting. Now, is that, are you going to recommend that to local city councilors as a way of handling the people in the vote?
No, absolutely not. Because if you're going to jump, I'd say do it from a first-floor window. That's very important. I'm afraid that is a moment of which I'm not very proud. We were being forced to vote on something that I thought was wrong. A number of my people in my party believed the same way, and they were shutting the doors and asking for a quorum by taking this bill by surprise on us. So a few of us snuck out the window so there wasn't a quorum. Not a moment I'm terribly proud of. Yes, I see a hand back there. Yes, sir.
During your election against General George McClellan, my question is what do you feel about his vice president? Understanding that that's our namesake, George Hunt Pendleton.
Well, I thought, well, what a wonderful job he's done in Oregon. Why in the world did he ever leave there? You know, I was, as you probably know, I was offered the governorship of the territory of Oregon back in 1848. I turned it down. I hope there are no hard feelings out there about that. Do you really? And how many times has it been voted on? I'm very glad. I'm very glad, truly. And yeah, oh, I haven't finished with this one. I can get long-winded. You'll have to forgive me. But yeah, I turned it down because the governorship, because anybody who thinks that Mary Lincoln's going to go across the plains in a covered wagon has got another thing coming. But I can only say I'm grateful that General McClellan is no more successful in that campaign than he was in his others. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, I understand that the Russians have offered in 1859 to sell a certain territory to our government. How do you feel about this potential acquisition of this icebox place called Alaska? Do you think that would be a prudent thing for our nation to consider?
Well, I have to admit that I have been so concentrated on the great task before us that I haven't given a lot of thought to this yet. I know that Seward, our Secretary of State, is very keen on this, and Seward's a very smart and very experienced man, and I suspect in the long run I will be listening to his advice on this. But we have managed to do some other things. We, if not expanded our borders, we have expanded our nation. Just even as we're fighting north and south, we are building a railroad east and west, uniting our country that way, bringing the west coast in to make sure that this is all one nation. And in fact, I hope some of the freed slaves will find land out there in the West because they've got skills. And I'm sure they will work much harder for themselves than they ever did as slaves. But in regard to Russian territory in North America, I'll leave that to Seward to consider right now and deal with that later in the term. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, you don't know this yet, but about 160,
Oh, you'd be surprised how much I don't know, but
about 160 years from now, a noted presidential historian by the name of Doris Kearns Goodwin is going to write a book called Team of Rivals that describes some appointments you made to your cabinet in either your first or second administration, appointments that weren't necessarily folks that saw eye to eye with you. Could you describe for us what you were thinking with those appointments?
what exactly is in these glasses that you've been drinking? Others have remarked that, yes, I appointed Chase, Seward, Stanton, people with whom I had occasionally had difficulties or were themselves hoping to become president. But I was sure that having as little experience as I did in national affairs, I needed experienced politicians around me, people who knew the issues well and could represent different parts of the country. And I was sure that whatever personal animus they might hold toward me, well, they would put that aside to serve their country. And I found that to be the case. This nation has been, I get all the credit. It's the Lincoln administration, everyone says. But I would look at every member of my cabinet, and I'm particularly grateful to those who had been perhaps opponents at one time or another for their service to their country, because they served as much as I did. But I've always held that there should be a very strict and very short statute of limitations on political quarrels. And I'm glad they've seen that the same way I have. Yes?
Yes, Mr. President.
Please.
During your life, did you ever have any regrets?
Did I have regrets during my life? There were moments when I regretted ever running for president. We all have regrets. I regret this terrible war has occurred. I regret every death that's been taken. I've made mistakes during this war that caused further bloodshed. But I have to keep going forward, as will this nation. And there's not much point dwelling on those regrets. The only people that haven't got regrets, I think, are people with very short memories. But yes, I have them. Too great to detail right here, but we have to go forward, and that's what I intend to do. We have perhaps one more question. Yes, Mayor Doyle.
Just seeking some advice, and I really congratulate you sticking to solving the war. There's a rift you mentioned. What advice and counsel would you give this country that at the healing of that rift that brings people back together and acceptance of people from all over the world may take a long time? What advice would you to encourage us, and how would you say we should make this happen?
This is going to be a long process, healing this rift, as you say. And I think, as you're implying, this may go on for some time. There's a regret that I have even before it's happened. We have to look to ourselves. Our Constitution begins, "We the people of the United States of America." Right, that's who this country is. We have to look to ourselves and see if we are being the best citizens we can be, to see if we will trust those we disagree with to have the same freedom we want for ourselves. There's been terrible debate even in the North among ourselves, and I sometimes think that if I'm given credit for anything, it will be keeping what's left of this union together in order to prosecute and finally finish this war. I have asked people to look to the better angels of their natures. And presidents such as myself, we can stand up here and say words, but unless we are speaking from the hearts not only of ourselves, but of our countrymen, it will do no good. We have to be the best people we can be. We have to allow others that we disagree with, without questioning their motives, even if we debate them on particulars. We've got to let them disagree and recognize they wish the best for their country too. Well, I could go on and on in the same tenor, but I think that will do it. Well, you have to forgive me. My duties call me elsewhere. I am weary, very weary. But there's so much I need to do before I can take that last train ride home. I must leave you now. Goodbye.
Wow. Now another one to add to the list, never to follow. Good God Almighty, as another famous person said. I want to thank you all for coming to this conference, and get home safe. And any thoughts, suggestions for next year, please share it with staff, not with me. But seriously, it's been great having you all here, and we'll see you. Where are we next year, everybody? Gene. Not Corvallis, right? Eugene? All right. See you there. Take care. Bye-bye.